Let us now discuss columns. As I have already told you briefly, that columns are those articles which could be found on the editorial page of the newspapers, but these are the articles that are written with the byline of the person who has written it. And these are basically opinion based articles which represent the opinion of a specific person, whoever is writing that column. So, let's look here. It says it's a weekly or fortnightly article written by a seasoned commentator who's either a journalist or a specialist. It could also be daily offering. So columns are published daily in a newspaper. So it is also a possibility that a specific journalist would write on a daily basis. But generally, journalists and columnists they write these on a weekly basis, or one in a 15 days, and something like that. So this is a regular publication in the newspaper, and it is written by a person who is a seasoned commentator. That seasoned commentator could be a journalist, and he could be any specialist of his or her field. Then it says the column has been often described as an editorial with a byline by the journalist. So generally, editorial, as you already know, is an opinion piece, but it represents the opinion of the newspaper, and it doesn't have a byline. They don't tell you who has written it, because it is newspaper's editorial board or the editor himself who writes it, and it presents the policy of the newspaper. In the case of columns, they are always published with a byline. That means that the name and even the picture of the columnist would be mentioned. That is because they are highly opinionated pieces. They present views on news. So there are going to be views of individuals about the latest happenings or any issue, and the person who writes it own the views. So they are always written with the byline and with the picture of the person who writes it. And the person who writes these columns are called columnists. So again, if you read here, it says it is a daily, weekly, or fortnightly article written by a seasoned commentator who's either a journalist or a specialist called columnist. So the person who writes these columns are called columnists. One thing which perhaps distinguish columns from all other types of writing within the newspaper is that they include diverse topics, and it's not just about politics. You can mostly read about national and international politics on columns in columns, because most of the journalists write about this. But you can also find columns which are about societal issues, which are about our culture, which are about the education sector, which may be about commerce or economy of the country, and all of that. There might be some even light-hearted or humorous articles or columns as well that you will find in on the editorial pages. So there is a wide variety which is covered in this columns domain. This is not possible in the regular news or in even in the editorial itself, because editorials are mainly about current issues, and of course news is going to be about current issue, and news has to follow a specific format where no opinion should be presented. But in columns, the columnist has the choice to write about anything that person wants, and that makes it more interesting, that makes it more appealing to the readers. Seasoned journalists express their opinions about national and international issues, from their writing choices to the subject that they are choosing to the language that they are using. Everything is their own choice. So they don't have to adhere to any hardcore editorial guideline while writing columns, because columns का मकसद ये होता है कि जो columnist है उसका अपना personal जो point of view है वो लिखा जाए, उसके personal style में लिखा जाए. If it follows the same style as that of a news story, तो सारे columns एक जैसे लगेंगे and it will kill the purpose. So for that very purpose, columns are different. और आप जिस भी columnist के columns पढ़ते रहते हैं from time to time, you will exactly know कि उनका writing style क्या है या उनकी political affiliation क्या है and all of that, because you will know by reading it regularly. So columnist का अपना peculiar style जो है, that is shown in their writing. These columnists are mostly highly sought after and highly paid journalists. Not everybody could become a columnist in a day or two. Most of the well-known journalists that we have, they are the ones जो के columns लिखते हैं, like Hamid Mir हो गया, Salim Safi हो गया, Hassan Nisar and Javed Chaudhry, and all these famous personalities. Even apart from that, if we look at the other sector, other kind of columnists, so generally people who are quite well known in their respective fields, they like to contribute for columns. So जो occasional contributors होते हैं, they might not even be paid by the publication, but जो regular columnist होते हैं, जिनका हफ्ते में एक column आना ही आना होता है, they are highly paid and highly sought after people. And one reason is that न्यूज़पेपर्स की जो ओवरऑल जो है आजकल के जमाने में सब्सक्रिप्शन ऑलरेडी कम हो गई हैं. लॉट ऑफ पीपल डोंट बाय न्यूज़पेपर्स, बट दोस पीपल हु बाय न्यूज़पेपर्स देयर आर लॉट ऑफ देम जो कि सिर्फ कॉलम्स पढ़ने के लिए लेते हैं, बिकॉज वो अपने फेमस कॉलमिस्ट के इतने बड़े फैंस होते हैं that they would want to read that. They would want to read कि जावेद चौधरी अपने कॉलम में क्या बात कर रहे हैं या हामिद मीर अपने कॉलम में क्या बात कर रहे हैं. सो इसलिए कॉलम में जो होते हैं they are highly paid people. Columns are liked because there is a diversity of thought and individuality which is reflected in its writing. चाहे वो उसका स्टाइल हो या चॉइस ऑफ वर्ड्स हो या पर्सनल व्यूज हो, इवन द टॉपिक दैट द पर्सन इज चूजिंग, ऑल ऑफ दैट इज बेसिकली person's own calling, that columnist's own calling कि वो किसके बारे में लिखना चाह रहा है. So not everybody writes about politics. Like in Pakistan, we have seen such illustrious people. Mustansir Hussain Tarar, for example, he used to write about his travel experiences. वो अपने travel logs की तरह अपने columns में भी अपनी जो मुख्तलिफ जगहों पे जाते थे, travel करके आते थे, तो उसके बारे में लिखते थे कि मैंने चीन में क्या देखा और मैंने रूस में क्या देखा और इस तरह की सारी चीजें. So that was not something which had any political hint to it, but it was a very interesting column because people used to like that and people used to read that. Similarly, if you read columns by say Wasatullah Khan, he is a very famous journalist. He writes for bbcurdu.com. So he has this peculiar style जिसमें थोड़ा सा satire का element होता है. So there is this satirical touch in his columns, and he might be telling you a story in his columns that this is a story about a person and this person goes there and whatever, but actually it's not, it would not be a story, it would be a satire, and by that person he would be meaning perhaps one of the representatives of the government. So वो बात कुछ कर रहे होते हैं लेकिन इशारा कुछ और तरफ होता है. So he had this very peculiar style which his followers and his readers definitely like. Similarly, if you will read columns of Javed Chaudhary for that matter, so he has this style that he will always start from some historical perspective or some historical incident. He will tell you that Mahmood Ghaznavi ke daur mein is tarah hua, and you would be like that perhaps this is something जो कि historical column है, but वो historical नहीं होता क्योंकि वो end पे कहीं ना कहीं लाके जोड़ के उसको करंट गवर्नमेंट से या करंट जो हालात है मुल्क के उससे जोड़ देते हैं. So that again is something very interesting because he has this style. So every writer would have his own style. Muhammad Hanif, if you have been reading his books and all, he also writes at times. उनका अपना स्टाइल होगा. नदीम फारूक पराचा लिखेंगे, वो भी थोड़े सटायर में लिखते हैं, सटायरिकल वे में, उनका अपना स्टाइल होगा. Some would be very serious, just like the editorial, जिसमें आपको थोड़े से एडिटोरियल्स पढ़ के आइडिया हो जाएगा कि न्यूज़पेपर की क्या पॉलिसी है. आपको किसी भी कॉलमिस्ट के थोड़े से कॉलम्स पढ़ के आइडिया हो जाएगा कि वो किस तरफ लीन करता है. Is that person towards the left or towards the right, और उसकी political affiliations क्या हैं. So if you are reading Auria Maqbool Jan for that matter, so उनके 2-3 कॉलम्स पढ़ के ही you can get an idea that he is a rightist in his approach. Or if you read Hamid Mir or some other writers, so you will know that they are leftist in their approach. So वो आपको idea हो जाता है to the readers that regularly read these columns. And the reason is because इतनी liberty होती है columnist को कि वो जो चाहे लिख सकते हैं. Generally these columns are also the least edited parts of the newspaper because उसमें बहुत ज़्यादा editorial cuts नहीं लगते हैं. Apart from the fact कि अगर जो एक डेजिग्नेटेड लेंथ है जिसमें वो पब्लिश होना है उससे ज्यादा लंबा लिख दिया गया है, सो अक्सर एडिटर्स थोड़ी बहुत चेंजिंग्स कर देते हैं या उसको रीराइट करने के लिए भेज देते हैं. बट जो आपके रेगुलर कॉलमिस्ट हैं उनको पता होता है कि उनको कितने वर्ड्स का कॉलम लिखना है और वो जनरली जितना भी लिखते हैं वो एज इट इज ही पब्लिश होता है. सो इट इज वन ऑफ द मोस्ट अनसेंसर्ड थिंग्स दैट यू कैन फाइंड इन द न्यूज़पेपर. Another thing is that most of the columns are related to current issues like politics and all of that, but at times columnists can also comment on the non-trending stories as well. So non-trending stories के ऊपर भी बात हो सकती है या other than politics भी बहुत ज़्यादा बात हो सकती है. For example, कोई environmental scientist जो है वो environmental issues के बारे में बात कर सकता होता है. We have a lot of educationists जो कि education से related columns लिखते हैं, like Dr. Tariq Rahman writes columns for educational policies in the country. Dr. Parvez Hudwai writes columns for about education and education system of Pakistan. So all these people, they could be of any field, they could write about their fields, or they could be journalists and they could write about any field. So it all depends on the person who's writing the column. These are few journalists जिनको हम top columnist of Pakistan कह सकते हैं. ठीक है, these are the ones जिनकी बहुत ज़्यादा रीडरशिप है. Most of them are the ones जो कि आपको टेलीविजन पे भी नजर आते होंगे मुख्तलिफ shows host करते हुए. But much before they became a television anchor person, they were journalists and they were columnists for the print media. So we have Javed Chaudhary, we have Hassan Nisar, Wasfullah Khan, Naseem Naji, Nusrat Javed, Nadeem Farooq Paraja, Hamid Mir, Salim Safi, Harun Rashid, Mujibur Rahman Shami, Rauf Dasra, Auria Maqbool Jan, Ayaz Amir, Sayyid Talat Hussain, and a lot of others. Generally कुछ articles या कुछ columns जो होते हैं उनके साथ एक regular title भी होता है, जैसे कि जावेद चौधरी का जो है वो 0 पॉइंट के नाम से लिखते हैं, हसन निसार जो है वो चौराहा के नाम से लिखते हैं. दैट इज द रेगुलर टाइटल ऑफ देयर कॉलम्स. इसके अलावा हर कॉलम का अपनी हेडलाइन अलग से होती है, बट दिस इज द टाइटल दैट दे हैव केप्ट फॉर देयर कॉलम. सो दे जहां भी हसन निसार का कॉलम होगा साथ में चौराहा भी लिखा होगा, बिकॉज वो इसी नाम से कॉलम लिखते हैं. In the slides, I have mentioned a few links. You can see those links. So Dawn, The Nation और जंग का लिंक मैंने पेस्ट किया हुआ है, but otherwise as well, if you want to read columns of any newspaper, आप उस newspaper के e-version पे जाओ और उसके editorial page पे या opinion page पे जाओगे, तो उधर आपको columns along with the name and the picture of that columnist would be shown, and you would know just by looking at it कि ये column है. And I would advise you to at least read 5 to 6 columns. 2-1 उर्दू के पढ़ लो, 3-4 इंग्लिश के पढ़ लो, ताकि आपको आइडिया हो कि कॉलम्स किस तरह जो है वो लिखे जाते हैं, या कॉलम्स किस तरह से जो है वो ओपिनियंस जो है वो प्रेजेंट की जाती हैं कॉलम्स में. कॉलम्स are perhaps the only article or only piece in the newspaper जहाँ पे आप first person pronoun भी यूज कर सकते हो, which is आप I यूज कर सकते हो या मैं यूज कर सकते हो, because आप अपनी ओपिनियन दे रहे हो. ये ना तो न्यूज़पेपर की ओपिनियन है, ना ही किसी जर्नलिस्ट की जो कि स्टोरी रिपोर्ट कर रहा है. You are not reporting, you are presenting your own view. So for that matter, you can use the word I or you can use the word मैं, जो कि थ्रू आउट आप बाकी किसी और किस्म की न्यूज़पेपर राइटिंग में नहीं यूज करते हो, अगर आप न्यूज स्टोरी लिख रहे हो या अगर आप एडिटोरियल यूज कर रहे हो. So that is again something that makes columns different from all other types of writing in a newspaper. With that, we have come to the end of this section, which was about opinion or editorial section of the newspapers. In this section, we discussed two things in details: editorials and then columns. And apart from that, I told you about letters to the editor and editorial cartoons. Right now in this course, there is no requirement to discuss that in detail, but they can also be found on the editorial section of a newspaper. Now in the next video, I am going to share news values with you guys, and now see you in the next video.